Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk about something that has suddenly become considerably more serious because the trade war between the United States and Canada is now escalating. Donald Trump has imposed new tariffs of 50% on billions of dollars of Canadian goods. And Canada has now responded by announcing that it will retaliate dollar for dollar, imposing its own tariffs on American products. And this is where things could start becoming very expensive for both countries because the USA and Canada aren't just two countries that happen to buy things from each other. Their economies are deeply interconnected. They share manufacturing supply chains. They trade hundreds of billions of dollars of goods every year. Canada supplies the USA with huge quantities of energy, raw materials, and timber. And America is by far Canada's largest customer. So what we're potentially seeing here is two extremely integrated economies deliberately making it more expensive to trade with each other. And at a time when energy markets are already under enormous pressure because of the war in Iran and the continuing problems around the Strait of Hormuz, this could become particularly important. So in this video, I want to explain exactly what has happened, why Donald Trump has imposed these new tariffs, why people are understandably confused about whether the tariffs are actually happening at all, what Canada has now announced in retaliation, and ultimately who stands to lose the most. But before we get into all of that, if you're enjoying my economic updates, could you please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, really would appreciate that. And if you have the option, if you see that funny little symbol sitting alongside the thumbs up, it's called the hype. It looks like a sort of diamond with a bit of a swoosh. If you can press that, then that will give this video a boost with the YouTube algorithm and help more people to view it. And it'll also put a smile on my face. Now, to understand what is happening today, we actually have to go back in time because this trade war didn't start with these 50% tariffs. It actually started back in 2025 when Donald Trump announced substantial tariffs against Canada and Mexico. One of the main reasons he gave at the time was the fentanyl drug problem. The Trump administration argued that illegal drugs, including fentanyl, were crossing America's borders, representing a national emergency. And using emergency economic powers, he imposed tariffs of 25% on most Canadian imports, with a lower tariff on Canadian energy, things like oil and gas. Now, that caused a considerable amount of controversy because although fentanyl is obviously an enormous problem in the United States, I can tell you myself, I was recently in Seattle and you see people staggering about in the streets. It is quite frightening. The amount coming across the Canadian border is relatively small. Canadian government figures using American border data suggest that less than 1% of fentanyl seized in the United States comes across the Canadian border. So Canada argued that imposing enormous tariffs on one of America's closest allies because of the fentanyl simply wasn't justified. And even politicians in the US questioned it. The US Senate actually voted 51-48 to terminate the national emergency that Donald Trump was using to justify those Canadian tariffs. But that didn't ultimately stop the tariffs because the measure didn't get enough to get through the legislative process. However, something much more important then happened. The tariffs went to court. And in February 2026, the US Supreme Court ruled that the emergency law Donald Trump had been using did not give the president the authority to impose tariffs. And that's one of the reasons the whole situation has become very confusing. We had the tariffs announced, we had the tariffs then delayed, we had negotiations, we had exemptions, we had courts becoming involved, we had different tariff rates applying to different products, and now we've got another 50% tariff. But this latest 50% tariff isn't simply the old fentanyl problem coming back again. This is something different. Donald Trump has now gone back to a law that was passed almost a century ago, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. And under this law, the president can impose tariffs of up to 50% if another country is deemed to be discriminating against American commerce. And the Trump administration said that's exactly what Canada has been doing. There are three particular areas that he's focusing on: alcohol, dairy products, and vehicles. Following the earlier trade dispute, Canadian provinces removed American alcoholic products from their shelves. The United States has also repeatedly complained about Canada's protected dairy market and the access American farmers receive compared with producers from other countries. And there have also been disputes relating to vehicles and the treatment of American manufacturers. So from the American government's perspective, Canada retaliated against American tariffs, discriminated against American companies, and Donald Trump is now retaliating against that retaliation, which gives you some idea of where this trade war is heading. The 50% tariffs were originally scheduled to come into effect on the 19th of August. Then, at the last minute, Donald Trump delayed them for 3 days. There appeared to be optimism that some sort of deal was going to be reached, and for a brief period it looked like the whole thing might disappear again. There was discussion about reducing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminium. There was discussions about reducing auto tariffs. Canada appeared willing to make compromises over American alcohol and some of the trade issues. Donald Trump was even talking about resurrecting the Keystone XL pipeline. So everything appeared to be moving towards an agreement. And then the negotiations collapsed. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney said the United States introduced new demands towards the end of the negotiations, which Canada regarded as unfair and uneconomic. His description was quite simple. America was asking too much and offering too little, so Canada walked away. As a result, the 50% American tariffs have now come into force. They affect somewhere in the region of 20 billion US dollars, or approximately 28 billion Canadian dollars of Canadian exports. That's roughly 5% of Canada's exports to the USA. So it's important to put this into perspective. This isn't a 50% tariff on everything Canada sells to the US, but neither is this happening in isolation. There are already major tariffs affecting steel, aluminium, automobiles, and lumber. So the bigger issue is the cumulative effect of an increasingly hostile trading relationship. And Canada has now announced its response. Mark Carney says Canada will match the latest tariffs dollar for dollar. Those tariffs are due to come into effect on the 8th of September. Canada said they'll be concentrated on sectors including American steel, dairy products, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. And interestingly, Carney openly acknowledged that this is going to hurt Canadians as well, because this is one of the strange realities of tariffs. When you impose tariffs on another country, you're not simply sending them a bill. You're putting a tax on products being imported into your economy. So Canadian companies importing American machinery or components will have to pay more. Canadian consumers buying American goods, they're going to be more expensive. And exactly the same thing will be happening in the USA. American importers bringing Canadian products into the US are the ones initially paying the tariff, and those higher costs will then work their way through into American businesses and ultimately into consumer prices. And this matters because the relationship between these two countries is absolutely enormous. In 2025, total trade in goods and services between Canada and the USA was around $872 billion. The US exported around $334 billion of goods to Canada and imported around $382 billion back. Canada is one of America's biggest customers, but from Canada's perspective, the dependency is considerably greater. Around 72% of everything Canada exports in terms of merchandise goes to the USA. We just think about that, that's around 3/4 of Canadian goods going to one country. So if you're asking which economy is potentially more vulnerable to a complete breakdown in trade, clearly Canada has more at stake relative to the size of its economy. But that doesn't mean America walks away unharmed, and energy is probably the best example. Canada is enormously important to US energy security. In 2025, energy trade between the two countries was worth around $137 billion. The US imported around $111 billion of Canadian energy, and crude oil represented the biggest part of that relationship. Now, normally that is important, but right now it's critical because we're in the middle of an energy crisis. The war in Iran has severely disrupted flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Global oil markets remain extremely nervous. Brent crude is trading at around the mid-90s per barrel level. Refined fuel markets are under severe pressure. Shipping patterns have been disrupted. So this would appear to be a particularly strange moment for the US and its largest secure energy supplier to be escalating a trade war with each other. Now, importantly, the latest round of 50% tariffs doesn't directly apply to Canadian energy, but that isn't really the point. The danger here is escalation. If Canada retaliates, America retaliates against Canada's retaliation, Canada then responds, and this expands into additional sectors, then energy eventually will become part of the wider economic conversation. And even without direct tariffs, uncertainty itself changes investment decisions. The same thing applies to timber or lumber. The US buys enormous quantities of lumber and other forestry products from Canada. That lumber goes into American homes, construction, renovation, packaging, manufacturing, and various other areas. So tariffs that increase the cost of Canadian wood doesn't simply hurt Canadian forestry companies. They can increase input costs for American builders and ultimately feed into housing costs. And then you've got vehicles. The North American automotive industry isn't really three completely separate industries in the US, Canada, and Mexico. It's one interconnected supply chain. Components can cross borders multiple times while a vehicle is being manufactured. So every tariff potentially adds another layer of cost into the production process. That's why trade wars between highly interconnected economies can become economically destructive remarkably quickly. Canada obviously faces the greater concentration risk. Around 72% of your exports going to one market isn't easy to replace those exports. Canada has therefore been aggressively trying to diversify. Exports to countries outside the United States grew strongly last year. The Canadian government is pushing new trade agreements and infrastructure that makes it easier to export resources towards Asia and Europe. And politically, this trade dispute may actually accelerate Canada's attempts to reduce its dependence on the US. But that itself may have consequences for America because for decades the US has benefited from having an enormous, stable, friendly supplier of oil, minerals, lumber, food, and manufactured products directly on its northern border. If Canada increasingly directs those products towards other markets, that changes the economics of North America. So ultimately, who wins this trade war? Well, potentially nobody. Canada has more to lose proportionately because it's far more dependent on US demand. There will be Canadian companies where losing access to the US market simply makes their business model uneconomic. So jobs could be lost, investment might be delayed, economic growth could suffer. But America isn't immune. American businesses importing Canadian materials will now face higher costs. American exporters facing Canadian retaliation could lose sales. Agricultural producers could be particularly vulnerable. Manufacturers could find supply chains becoming more expensive. And consumers on both sides of the border could ultimately end up paying higher prices. Which is why I think the biggest issue here isn't necessarily the $20 billion of products currently facing these new tariffs. The biggest issue is what happens next, because we've moved from threats to actual tariffs. Canada has moved from negotiation to retaliation. Trade talks have effectively broken down, and there are currently no new negotiations scheduled. So the world's largest economy is now engaged in an escalating trade dispute with one of its closest allies and biggest trading partners at precisely the same time that the global economy is dealing with an energy shock and enormous geopolitical uncertainty. And if this trade war continues to expand, the economic damage could become considerably larger than the headline 50% tariffs suggest. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and if you have the option of hitting that hype button, then please press that. That would be fantastic. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end and supporting me. And thank you to everyone that's supporting me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you for that enormous generosity. Really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter through YouTube membership or Patreon, thank you so much. That really does help to keep me motivated to know that there's people out there that really genuinely appreciate all of this content. It does motivate me to make more videos. So thank you so much. And if you'd like me to put a smile on your face, then check out one of the jokes that I've posted recently.